Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Sindhu Blume.
And I'm Scott McCandless. It is the week of June 5th, and this is your Monday briefing. With the debt ceiling agreement behind us and signed into law on Friday, we're now turning our attention to international tax legislation introduced by House Ways and Means Committee Republicans.
The bill is a response to unilateral measures taken by other countries in response to the OECD's two-pillar project. And to find out what we need to know about this legislation, we're joined by Pat Brown. Pat, thanks so much for being here.
Great to be here, Sindhu.
So set the stage for us. Talk about the key provisions in this bill, but also, focus on the intent.
Yeah, so look, this is clearly a messaging bill. It's not likely to go anywhere in this Congress. In fact, very unlikely to go anywhere in this Congress. But it's really intended to send a message from, in particular, congressional Republicans to other countries to essentially say, we are not happy with the current state of the discussions, the negotiations, in particular around Pillar 2. And so a big part of this legislation introduces a new concept called an extraterritorial tax, and essentially says when other countries introduce an extraterritorial tax, and the Treasury Department, which is required under this legislation to provide a report to the Congress, naming countries that have introduced these types of taxes. If other countries introduce extraterritorial taxes, the United States will take essentially retaliatory measures under our tax system. That's one of the two definitions, and that's very clearly focused on Pillar 2. The other definition in the legislation is a so-called discriminatory tax. Now, what's interesting about a discriminatory tax is that is focused, it appears to be focused on things like digital services taxes or DSTs. And of course, the OECD's Pillar 1 project is an attempt to come up with a framework that would essentially take away DSTs. But we know Pillar 1 is stuck in the mud. It's not going anywhere, right? At least not in the foreseeable future. And so we have one of the two prongs of this legislation that is focused, if you will, on the outcome of Pillar 2, which is the UTPR and the focus on the UTPR. The other piece of this legislation, discriminatory taxes, is focused on, I will say, the fact that Pillar 1 has not been able to come up with a satisfactory solution at all and is just not moving anywhere. So very clearly a focus on other countries' potential actions. On the one hand, under Pillar 2, that's extraterritorial. On the other hand, countries acting, if you will, in the absence of an effective Pillar 1. So that's really what we're seeing.
Okay.
Pat, you had mentioned the secretarial tax definition, and it seems as if the legislation is focused on the UTPR, the Under-Tax Profits Rule, but that it does not seem to focus on income inclusion rules or a CFC regime or a domestic top-up tax.
Yes.
Can you infer anything from those omissions?
Yeah, well, I think it's pretty clear. It's a great point, Scott, and I think it's pretty clear that the reason it was drafted this way is not by accident. So we obviously have our GILTI regime, a so-called top-down minimum tax, looking from the ultimate parent entity down at foreign affiliates, and essentially asking the question, has sufficient tax been paid by those foreign affiliates? GILTI, if you will, is an extension of CFC regimes that have been around for a long time. The United States, of course, introducing the first way back in 1962. So these concepts are sort of more conventional, the GILTI regime, CFC regimes. You mentioned qualified domestic minimum taxes, also a concept, if you will, a new concept introduced by Pillar 2, but that is really a country taxing income within its own borders. So that is obviously a long-standing concept that predates even CFC taxes, right? I mean, it sort of goes back to the very essence of an income tax itself. So what has clearly gotten underneath the skin of Chairman Smith and the House Republicans is this UTPR. It is the idea of imposing tax on income that effectively is in no way connected to your jurisdiction, either by ownership, top-down ownership, or indeed activity within your border. So they are clearly trying to draw that distinction, and the definition of an extraterritorial tax in the legislation makes it very clear. We are pulling out. We are not including within this definition minimum taxes like a GILTI regime, nor are we including domestic minimum taxes. They very carefully drafted that to pull those things out.
Pat, you mentioned with respect to the discriminatory taxes, they appear to be focused on DSTs and possibly other unilateral measures. Can you get into some detail about what those provisions are?
Yeah, so the definition of extraterritorial, which we were just discussing with Scott, does seem to be very tightly focused on the UTPR. Discriminatory taxes, it's a little bit more of a challenging drafting exercise because, of course, if you're trying to target DSTs, even the OECD's language around this, they always talk about DSTs and other similar measures. So you're essentially trying to define a concept that is pretty amorphous, doesn't exactly exist today, DSTs, because countries have done this in different ways, as opposed to the